Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we have our resident expert on all things CIA and all kind of evil black ops and all that kind of stuff, Jeremy Kuzmarov. Today, we're going to talk about germ warfare. Let's go. Well, another time for us anti-science crazies to come up and talk about germ warfare, right? Something that has been going on for many, many years. Something that even in the founding of the United States, the Brits did it. It's something that was done against the Native Americans by the U.S. My understanding, I've read documents that said it's the Indian Wars. The U.S. did it. So germ warfare is nothing new. I recall reading about back in like the Middle Ages where they would literally take a body with smallpox and put it on a catapult and catapult the body with smallpox into like a one of these city states that they had laid siege to. So germ warfare is nothing new. But of course, we got to keep denying it because that's a pretty evil thing for a government to do, and to actually admit to its people that they were involved in germ warfare, well, people might get suspicious maybe of even recent events, perhaps. Anyway, let's talk with Jeremy Kuzmarov. Jeremy, tell us about, before we get going, tell us about your site and, a little bit of the background of what people need to know about covertactionmagazine.com.
Okay, well, Covert Action Magazine, it was originally Covert Action Information Bulletin that was founded by CIA whistleblower Philip Agee, who wrote the book Inside the Company, a CIA diary, kind of blowing the whistle on the CIA's nefarious activity that he had participated in mostly in South America. And the magazine was devoted to exposing the CIA, which Agee saw that it was operating in violation of U.S. and international law. And the magazine had a naming names column where without CIA agents. And today it's called Covert Action Magazine. It was kind of rebranded by Agee's son about 5-6 years ago, and we're trying to carry on that legacy of exposing the CIA and so-called deep state, and also providing critical analysis in general of U.S. foreign policy. Because Philip Agee came to see that U.S. foreign policy was driven by corporations and Wall Street interests that drove these, nefarious foreign policy interventions. So a lot of our articles try and spotlight the political economic dimension of U.S. imperialism.
Well, let's get started talking about. Sorry, I'm just clicking on your site. Let's talk about this. A very interesting article you put up, and everybody, you guys need to go to covertactionmagazine.com. And if you look on the side, there's a little area where you can search. You search for all of the stuff they're doing and search for whatever you want. And you'll find like of JFK and all kinds of stuff like that. Let's start with this. CIA documents prove the agency was lying to the public about germ warfare in Korea for decades. One of the things, let's start with this. I think it's interesting. Frank Olson. In fact, there was a documentary made about it. The CIA guy who was basically allegedly committed suicide in New York, but he's connected to this. If you could talk about, let's start with Frank Olson, who he is and what people think about him and what the truth about him is.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and actually, listeners, I have another article at Covert Action on Frank Olson, so I researched that case in depth. In fact, I was asked to I started the research. I was asked to write an article in a volume on whistleblowers at an academic conference, and it was an academic volume. And then when I attended the conference, I was attacked by a guy who is in the CIA, gatekeeper, who tries to keep this out of academia. His name is Richard Immerman. And then they refused to include my article in that volume, and even refused to pay my airfare when they had traveled to New York. and they promised to pay me anyway. So there's still some taboo on these issues, even though it's been 75 years, and the facts are pretty well established. My article drew on a lot of already published research and investigations, including by Frank Olson's son. Yeah, so Frank Olson was he was a CIA biochemist at the Fort Detrick Center in Maryland. That was, and Garland knows all about this because he lives near there. It's a secret facility that was set up to develop the CIA's germ warfare program at the end of World War II. Because the Germans and Japanese and Russians and had developed their own programs, so the U.S. felt they were behind, so they had to set this up, and they kind of nefariously recruited Japanese scientists who had been involved in nefarious germ warfare operations in China during World War II, including a General Shiro Ishii, who was a grade A war criminal and developed all kinds of sadistic experiments on humans and developed these disease flies that they would unleash in China when the Japanese invaded China. And Olson was involved in that from the beginning. He worked under Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who known as the CIA's Dr. Death. And Gottlieb was heading these germ warfare operations. They do all kinds of experiments at Fort Detrick. And they killed a lot of animals. It was also inhumane toward animals as part of these experiments. And then Olson, yeah, he was a top scientist with a PhD from the University of Wisconsin. And he went to Korea several times to develop, germ warfare operations there that were actually deployed. We can get into how new documents and new evidence confirms what was long known by people who had already investigated it, that this was actually used. But then Olson had misgivings about it. He saw that this was so unethical, and he had a moral conscience, I guess, unlike many of his colleagues. And he was also involved with MK Ultra type experiments with different drug experimentation on prisoners of war, including Nazis at the end of the war. Captured Nazi officials. They did all kinds of experiments, and then they were applying this to other people as well, and in war zones like Korea. So those are the two things he was involved with that were really highly unethical. And he said to a colleague that this was Nazi type stuff. And I should mention, not only did they develop these programs through recruitment of Japanese scientists, but also Nazis under the Operation Paperclip, where they brought Nazi scientists to the United States who were also war criminals who had developed a germ warfare for the Nazis in World War II. And Dr. Kurt Blom was the head of the Nazi germ warfare program, and he was recruited by the CIA under Operation Paperclip, and he helped develop American germ warfare. So Olson saw this connection with Nazism and the Japanese, sadistic Japanese warfare methods in China, and saw what they were doing in Korea as well, these unethical drug testing under MK Ultra. And he started to express misgivings and to his wife, and he kind of hinted to his wife that he was involved in something terrible, and it was eating away at his conscience. But I think he gave the impression that he was going to be a whistleblower. He may have hinted to some of his colleagues, and so they got wind of the fact that he was not comfortable with the projects they were doing, and that he was a threat to reveal this to the public as a whistleblower. And he realized he was in trouble. He told his wife cryptically, "I made a terrible mistake, because I think he maybe showed his card that he was having these misgivings, and they saw him as a threat to become a whistleblower and to reveal these secret projects." And that's when they murdered him. They brought him to a retreat. They drugged him with LSD, but that was not the source of his death. That was just to disorient him, because the plan, they took him to a hotel in New York, and then what we know now is, because originally they said, oh, he jumped out of the window because first they totally covered up. They said it was a suicide. Then when his family started asking questions. In the 70s, they were brought to Washington, and the Ford administration gave them a settlement of like $1 million and said, "Oh, we gave him LSD, and he went insane, and that's what led to his suicide." But then, when Alice Olson died, the mother, his wife, it was so sensitive for her, and it left her depressed. And I guess it was the kind of thing like you can't talk about it in the family. It was just a sore spot. But when she died, the son, who's a very bright guy who had a PhD and worked in the field of psychology, um, he decided to reopen the investigation, and he hired a top forensic scientist, and they re-exhumed the body. And the study found that the cause of death was a blunt force trauma to the head, that he had been beaten before he fell out of the window. And actually, from the beginning, there were people on the scene, like the doorman, saw some very suspicious things. At first, yeah, he saw that because there was an Unsolved Mysteries episode about this, which was very good, and that was my favorite show as a kid because they would take up these kind of cases and do a serious investigation. And they interviewed, yeah, the doorman in that episode, and he said, well, that glass in that hotel window was very, very thick, and you can't just crash through it. Maybe if he like ran through the entire hotel and was like going extremely fast, maybe he could have cracked the glass by hurtling his body at it, but it's very almost impossible. So that was a suspicion right away. And also, he was in the room with Robert Lashbrook, who was a CIA operative, and the doorman heard that instead of calling the police after he jumped out of the window, he called Sidney Gottlieb and said he's gone. That was because they recorded all the calls from the room. In those days, I think, 'cause this is in the early 50s, you had to reach an operator. So there's a recording of Lashbrook saying he's gone before even the police were called. So that's obviously very suspicious. And then when they exhumed the body, it was shown blunt force trauma to the head. And that the CIA actually developed an assassination manual that was released some years after the Olson death, and his death fits the exact paradigm in the CIA assassin model, where beaten over the head, and then you make it look like a suicide because they had a baseball bat. He was beaten with a baseball bat. Then they used the bat to crack this glass, which was a thick glass in the hotel window. You can't just hurtle your way out of it. Then they threw him out, and then the cover story was that he jumped. So this was to cover up the germ warfare because he knew about it. And a friend of his, like years later, said when the son was probing into it and he interviewed some of his old friends and colleagues, and one of them said, "Oh, yes, your father knew about Korea and the germ warfare," and that made him very uneasy.
Wow. So let's get into the actual germ warfare and the documents that have been released by the CIA and what we can learn from them.
Well, yeah, the CIA unwittingly, because for years there was a cover up over this. So, yeah, the CIA had developed germ warfare as a weapon of war in Korea. And they thought, this was an easy way to kill the Koreans and maybe, I mean, the strategy of like terror bombing North Korea that the population will give up, in the face of unimaginable hardship of bombing and disease outbreaks, they'll just give up and stop supporting their government. Although that strategy didn't work, and North Korea is still resisting to this day, and it gave legitimacy to the North Korean government. But and there were some investigations at the time. Rumors started coming out, and then that this was going on. This germ warfare, and then you had reporting by Wilfred Burchett, was an Australian correspondent who was actually the first Westerner to report honestly about the atomic bomb and the horrendous costs, because the military had imposed censorship, and it was being reported that there was no radiation sickness or no side effects from people living in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But Wilfred Burchett broke through the censorship and reported the truth. And then he went to Korea and he exposed this, and he was traveling around the country and he interviewed people who observed these strange bombs where flies would come out and that there were disease outbreaks in certain areas. So he was the first to report on this, but they attacked him as a communist, just like today they attack independent reporters like for Syria, Eva Bartlett and Vanessa Beeley were reporting the truth about some of the horrible things going on in Syria and Ukraine, and they just attacked them as Assad lovers or Putin apologists to dismiss them. So they did the same thing with Wilfred Burchett. Uh, and then there were some serious, with his reporting, it prompted various serious investigations. One was headed by a British scientist named Joseph Needham, who was a brilliant scientist with a brilliant career at a top university in England. And he carried out a study with a team, and they concluded that, based on interviews with eyewitnesses and scientists and public health officials in China, and he was an expert in China, though, of course, they smeared him because he was sympathetic to the Chinese Revolution and he was a leftist. So they said the same thing, oh, he's a communist, even though it was because I did some of my own research, including at the National Archive in Washington, and I reviewed his report, and it was a very professionally done report with a lot of documentation about this germ warfare, and it was like 100-page report he compiled. And then there were a couple other scientific teams, and there was a Canadian, I think, a priest who was working, Stephen Endicott or James Endicott. And then they attacked him, including the Canadian press, as a communist. And so it was documented at the time. And then you had some pilots came out with confessions. There were about 12 pilots who were captured, and they admitted in Chinese captivity what they did. But then it was claimed that they had been brainwashed by the Chinese, and this was a false confession. And that was actually the basis for the official reason for developing the Operation MK Ultra, because the CIA said, "Oh, these pilots have been brainwashed, and the Chinese must have used drugs, so we better start developing drugs and improving our interrogation."
So 25 pilots admitted that they were using germ warfare.
Exactly.
And all of them were brainwashed in exactly the same way to say exactly the same thing, huh?
Yeah.
According to the CIA.
Yeah, exactly. And then there was a study carried out recently by a historian who really analyzed in depth their confessions. He got the documents and to test whether it was authentic or not. And he found that there was rich detail in those confessions that, and that's one way, and you're a police investigator, so you know that. When you assess somebody's confession, you look at things like, are they getting the detail? I mean, if their story doesn't make sense, then they may have made it up. But if the details are very, very precise, and then other facts confirm those details, then it appears to be very believable. So that's what this historian found when he really analyzed in depth those confessions. But yeah, there had been a CIA campaign for decades, and they employed a lot of historians. Then it got after 40 years or so, it became history. So they employed historians to try and discredit the pilots or to claim that this was a hoax. And they claim in the 90s, some stories came out by historians that this was a Russian plan. And then one historian claimed that there were some documents that he found in the Russian archive, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that pointed to some kind of Russian plan to accuse the U.S. of germ warfare, and that the Russians had helped stage some scenes. But it didn't match up because nobody could see these documents that he had. So he claimed that there were these documents, and then it doesn't make sense. How could the Russians orchestrate this whole thing? And what completely unravels that story in these new documents. Yeah, because Thomas Powell has just published a new book that I reviewed. My article is a review of his book, which is outstanding. And his father actually was one of the first to investigate this. His father was the editor of the China Monthly magazine, which was provided critical reporting and analysis of U.S. foreign policy in Southeast Asia during the 1940s and 50s. And it also just reported on China and the Chinese Revolution. And he wrote some pioneering articles. He was also blacklisted in the McCarthy era, the father, Bill Powell. And I think they put pressure on the magazine, and it was forced to shut down because it was doing great journalism and revealing this kind of stuff. He was attacked as a communist. And I think he moved to San Francisco. He ran an antique shop, and then he made enough money to retire comfortably. So he resumed his writing career in the 80s, the father, and he wrote some important articles about the Japanese, how the CIA and U.S. military agencies had recruited these Japanese scientists to develop the germ warfare program. And he did some pioneering research. And then, the son has wrote this powerful book. And he starts the book by discussing these CIA documents that they released unwittingly. He thinks it was some younger CIA people who didn't know about the whole history of the CIA cover-up, and they didn't realize that because they were seemingly mundane documents, but they're actually explosive documents that prove once and for all the CIA was lying for 70 or 80 years. And because their documents, their CIA reports of the public health initiatives taken by the Chinese and North Koreans to deal with the germ warfare attacks. So it shows that they developed a public health program, and it details about how they're trying to cope with this. So it proved that this went on because the CIA was monitoring the public health programs, how they're trying to treat the people with the diseases and prevent these disease outbreaks from spreading. So that proves that there was germ warfare because they had to deal with it. It wasn't just set up by the Russians. Why would the Chinese their health professionals had to deal with this, and the CIA was reporting on it. So these documents prove, and again, I think he thinks it was a younger CIA person. They made a mistake to declassify this because it showed that for 70 years the CIA lied to the public, and they used all kinds of devious ways to lie and cover up what they were doing, and murdered the scientist who may have threatened to expose it years earlier.
What kind of diseases? What kind of stuff were they doing? What kind of diseases were they using against Koreans, and how were they, spreading them?
Well, that's a good question. I I don't know all the details or from memory from reading that book and other books I've read and some other research, but from what I know they were dropping pest-laden bomb. They were special bombs packed with these flies. So it wasn't actually a bomb, but when the bomb fell on the ground, it opened up and flies came out. And that's what people witnessed. And Wilfred Burchett witnessed that there were flies to regions, like he was traveling all around North Korea, and the people were telling him that there were flies they'd never seen before. And that was very strange. And some witnessed the bomb and told them about that. And he may have even witnessed a bomb himself. So that I know. As far as the diseases, I'm not 100% sure. It's in the Needham report. I can't remember all those details. But they were pretty serious diseases. And I don't know.
I think one of them was like encephalitis. I think encephalitis was one of them. I think there was allegations that they tried to unleash bubonic plague.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. And there was also Al Jazeera did a special on this, and they found the bombs were similar to bombs Japan had used in China. So that was another sign that they had developed this from these Japanese scientists led by Shiro Ishii that they recruited. But I think you're right. They tried to spread the bubonic plague and some serious disease and plagues. And I don't know. I don't know if it's known today how many died from this. I know the Chinese contained it rather effectively because they did have very good public health system that the Maoist government had developed in China. So I know they actually did a pretty good job containing it, but I don't know if it's known the numbers that died.
It's interesting that the the important part that Fort Detrick played in this, in light of my and many other people's findings and arguments that the Fort Detrick likely played a significant part in the COVID whatever you want to call it, leak, release, whatever anybody wants to call it, that Fort Detrick seems to be a place that it's at the heart of the what they call a bio research program. What Victoria Nuland referred to when they found out that there was 46 laboratories in Ukraine on Russia's border as the bio research program, but appears much more likely to be a bioweapons program.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting connection. Yeah, because the Nixon administration officially did ban germ biological warfare and biological weapon research, but then it came back through the gain of function research and some of the measures. I think, and you know a bit better than me, but I think right after 9/11 they passed some measures to support this kind of gain of function research. And yeah, it has this history of these. It's kind of a place right out of the X-Files show, which was popular. I used to watch that in the 90s and early 2000s, and they're doing these kind of secretive and strange experiments, and it's some pretty dark stuff. And there's a good chance that's how the COVID came about. And I remember I read Robert Kennedy's book, and that's one thing he discussed. And I thought, convinced me a bit because that was at the time that there were so many smear attacks on Kennedy. But he did a good job tracing some of the history that I had studied, and that's now pretty well documented about these programs in the early Cold War with Olson. And he covered that in like the first chapter of his book, and he presented this as kind of continuity. So that kind of resonated. That argument seems to make a lot of sense.
Well, the other thing that I think it's important to look at too is, and this is something that always makes me suspicious. I had Ray McGovern on, and we were talking about the Seth Rich case, right? And one of the things that I discussed was as soon as that happened in the Seth Rich murder, et cetera, and people said, wait, didn't he work for the DNC? And didn't he have access to the DNC servers and all of the files that went to WikiLeaks? And immediately everywhere online, that was everybody was attacked, and you weren't even allowed to say anything about. So if you use the name Seth Rich, that was muted on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, right? And the many instances it seems to me that the instances of when a person is attacked, on do you have to go?
No, go ahead.
Okay, that to me, likewise here, when we see that the people who started researching this, some of them were like charged with sedition, who were attacked. COVID in the beginning, when people said, well, could this be a lab leak or something? They were attacked. That history of when people start looking into something where there's significant evidence to their argument, they're attacked, they're charged with crimes, in some instances thrown out of hotel windows, things of that nature.
Yeah, you can see the parallel with that era because now, it took 80 years through this hapless CIA clerk to release these documents that confirms it now. But that's 80 years later, and a lot of people are dead, who are involved in the cover up, and the younger generation forgot about it. So it's not as explosive politically now, although it does have some political implications today, because if you realize the CIA was lying about that they did develop these bioweapons in the 50s, they used them in the Korean War, killed a lot of people, and covered it up and smeared all the people who were the truth seekers and truth tellers. and that pattern is just repeating itself today. I mean, that's why, yeah, I as somebody who teaches history, I tell the students, look, we can learn from history. You see the patterns keep repeating itself. And I mean, which side of history do you want to be on? Do you want to be on the side of the cover up, or do you want to be on the side of the truth? Do you want to be on the side of war crime and atrocity, or on the side of humanity? So, and with the COVID, I think now is the dominant FBI theory that it would allow the FBI is now saying, I mean, it's coming pretty quickly in this case to acknowledge the lab leak is something I think the FBI is now their top theory about the COVID. So, it's slowly coming out that I mean, all the alternative explanation, the bat, have been disproven completely. So we're left only with the lab manufacturer. And then the question is, was it a leak or was there some kind of nefarious conspiracy? Yeah, and again, the way these people were smeared, the Burchetts, the Needhams, it's just a repeat of how people who, now they just call them conspiracy theorists, and they're shadow banned and attacked and ridiculed. But truth is on their side, and 50 years from now, we'll be heralding them, or any historian who looks at it, sees who's on the right and who is wrong. Unfortunately, most of the public maybe lost attention by that point. It's not as explosive politically, and these powerful people, I guess they survived in positions of power. They didn't go to jail, but they're on the wrong side of history ultimately.
Look, here's the perfect example. This is August, but this happened back in June. Fort Detrick lab shut down after failed safety inspection. All research halted indefinitely, right? All research at the Fort Detrick lab. So this happened in June. So they go on. This is in Frederick at the time. CDC sent a cease and desist order and on due to multiple causes, right? They go on and on and on. So we've got this, the perfect example. Fort Detrick shut down. I believe it was in June, right? And then here we go. It shut down in June. And then suddenly, let me see if I can get this up. Shockingly, right after that happens. Now, this is all before COVID. This is in the summer before COVID. Look at this. Cause of respiratory illness is still unknown after dozens sickened at Virginia retirement community, right? Fairfax County health officials said they don't have a cause of the respiratory illness that sickened more than 60 residents. Well, many of them died. And, you look at that and you're like, isn't that interesting? Fort Detrick was shut down, and then a respiratory illness showed up at a nearby retirement home, Virginia retirement home. Then a respiratory illness showed up at another nearby retirement home that spread just like COVID, spread like hell, killed a bunch of people, within weeks. Now, this was in the summer before COVID, and then
One lesson to listeners: when you retire, do not retire near Fort Detrick.
Exactly.
You don't know what they're doing there.
And then let's add another one. And then something shocking happened. So we've got a mystery. We've got COVID shuts down. I mean, we've got the Fort Detrick lab shuts down. We've got a mystery illness showing up at retirement homes, killing a bunch of people. But wait a minute, something else happens. Whoa, August 16th, a mystery lung illness linked to vaping. Health officials investigate nearly 100. So we've got Fort Detrick shuts down. A mystery illness starts showing up at retirement homes, killing people. Then what do you know? A mystery vaping lung illness. And if you look into the symptoms for this vaping lung illness, they're identical to COVID. A mystery lung illness from vaping that's identical to COVID that, might I add, as soon as COVID showed up, the mystery lung illness disappeared. Never another article about it after COVID. And then let me add one more to you. Let me add one more. So then we've got that. And then we've got the next move, which is kind of interesting. And that is The next month, look at the date here, September 19th. So June, July, and August, we have Fort Detrick mysteriously shuts down. We have a mystery lung illness shows up at retirement homes. We have a mystery vaping illness that shows up, and this is in August. And then in September, executive order on modernizing influenza vaccines in the United States to promote national health. And watch this. What we're going to do is search for the word pandemic. The word pandemic shows up 18 times. Pandemic, 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 pandemic. So after a mysterious, if you put these things together, and I'm just doing this real quick, so people can go to my Substack, and on my Substack, they'll find my origins of COVID. But just putting that together, just a simple timeline. I'm a former investigator. Simple timeline. Fort Detrick shuts down. A mysterious respiratory illness starts showing up nearby that's spreading like wildfire and killing a bunch of old people. A mysterious vaping disease suddenly shows up. And within 4 weeks after this, all of this happens, the president of the United States signs an order on modernizing influenza vaccines in the United States that has the word pandemic in it 18 times. That literally says it's a pandemic response document. And here's the really weird part about it. Rather than putting the CDC or the National Institute of Health in charge of it, they put the Department of Defense in charge of it. Might I add one more thing? I got to add one more thing to this, so people will maybe be motivated to go to my maybe people may be motivated to check this out. Not that any of this is related, but Johns Hopkins, the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. But now Trump puts out this pandemic response document in September. Keep in mind something. We're told that COVID didn't start until November. This is all before any thought of a pandemic. There's no pandemic, no reason to believe there's a pandemic. All this is happening, right? Before that, right after Trump does that, Event 201, right? The Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, in partnership with the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, hosted Event 201, a high-level pandemic exercise. The exercise illustrated where public and private partnerships will be necessary during the response to a severe pandemic. Now, what was that pandemic about? Let me read from the Event 201. This is specifically the scenario. So, if we put it all together, what was the Event 201 scenario? What was this pandemic tabletop exercise that mysteriously occurred before anybody thought there'd be a pandemic, apparently, before anything? The Event 201 scenario, let me read this to you right off of their website. Event 201 simulates an outbreak of a novel zoonotic coronavirus transmitted from bats to pigs to people that eventually becomes efficiently transmissible from person to person, leading to a severe pandemic. Isn't that amazing? Our government started preparation and actually did a simulation tabletop exercise for what? An outbreak of a novel zoonotic coronavirus. And wouldn't you know it, oddly, a novel zoonotic coronavirus appeared right afterwards. And lucky thing for us, they were prepared for it. If you put those things together, you don't have to be a professional investigator to see where that leads, Jeremy.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, and so it goes back to what we were saying before with Fort Detrick and the danger of it, and why, you know, the late Professor Francis Boyle, who passed away, but his discussion of how all this should be shut down. Because in the same way, you know, if you think about it, now there's the internet. So if something leaks out of Fort Detrick and a bunch of people die, everybody will say, hey, what's going on? What's happening? In the 1940s, in the 1950s, when they were doing all of these nasty little things, if something leaked out and a bunch of people died in Virginia or it spread around, nobody would even know where it came from. And they would have no way of nobody would even know there was like a pandemic where a bunch of people were dying, because it wouldn't be on the internet. Only the local people would know. Did you hear about Bob? Yeah, Bob, a whole bunch of people died in our town. Isn't that terrible? And that would be the long and short of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's true. Yeah. And there's a book on the Olson case by Hank Albarelli Jr. called The Terrible Mistake, based on what he had told his wife, kind of cryptically realized he was in trouble because they saw him as a threat to become a whistleblower. But he discusses how there were experiments, like some of the stuff they were testing at Fort Detrick. They may have done some experiments, like release some gases in the air in San Francisco, in the subway, and like they're testing if people get sick or not. So they're actually carrying out these kind of experiments, and that I think leads up to COVID, that this was some kind of test.
Yeah,
I agree. It's dangerous when there's no oversight. You have these mad scientists at work developing these diseases, and then you have some mad people in power. So it's a very bad, situation.
Yeah, I've often said, because there are people that'll say, well, they released it or it was a leak. We don't know. We have at this point, maybe years later, we'll find out any way of knowing how it got out of the lab. Somebody could have released it. The government could have released it. Some unscrupulous individual could have, a mad scientist at it were, could have said, I'm going to release it. It could have clandestinely. It could have been an accident. We don't know. You know what I mean? But one thing that it seems apparent, that they're doing things in Fort Detrick and numerous other labs. Let me add this. A guy, I don't know if you know, what's his name? Sam Husseini. He did some really good work. Do you remember the big Ebola outbreak in Africa in 2014? And there was all this discussion about they were going to bring some of the Ebola victims here, and they brought them here to where I live. Took them to Johns Hopkins and all that kind of stuff. And there was all this horror and fear, right? He did some work because the local Africans said it came from a U.S. lab. And the U.S. lab was working on Ebola, and they were working on a specific kind of Ebola that wasn't found in that region, had never been found in that region. And it showed up in that region. And here's the interesting thing that Sam Husseini found out. What they said was patient 0 was out in the woods playing with bats or monkeys or something like that. And that's how they got it, right? But patient 0 was like 3 years old. And his parents were like, no, we would never let our 3-year-old go. We lived in a town, and we don't go out in the forest, and we don't play with monkeys and bats because you could get bitten by a friggin' poisonous snake or something. No, this 3-year-old could not possibly have. So even the story about how patient 0 got it made no sense. None of it made sense. It wasn't from around that area, that particular strain of it. Patient 0 was 3 years old or 18 months, really young, couldn't have possibly gotten it in the way that they said. And there was a lab right there that was working on specifically that kind of. And in fact, the guy who ran the lab, Biden ended up bringing him in as and putting him in a really high level in his cabinet. So let's just say, as always, there are those who suspect that the original SARS and MERS and a lot of these other things that, a lot of these were, let's not forget, they were coronavirus. MERS was the Middle Eastern, what was really deadly, the original SARS. So I think these are things for people to do what I did if they get a chance, research them as best you can, find a lot of information. Sam Husseini did a lot of work on this, and this is great work. Once again, let me show everybody your good work. Here's what I'm going to do. Also, before we go, for those who may also want more info on COVID, go to Covert Action Magazine and just search the word COVID, and you'll see, look at that, documents all over the place. Way back from 2022, Wuhan red herring, COVID origins. You can see that that the back and look, August 8th of 2020, You can see that at Covert Action Magazine, they were doing a lot of good work on COVID. Whatever you want to find out about, there's a lot of stuff there. So everybody go to covertactionmagazine.com. Jeremy, thank you very much. Certainly appreciate it. And you're also on like X and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, well, I have a Substack, so you can subscribe to my Substack. Appreciate that. It's too hot for the mainstream.
Yeah, yeah, that's for sure. All right. Thanks a lot, man. Certainly appreciate it. Everybody, here's what's important. Number 1, hit like. Number 2, hit subscribe. Number 3, share this on all your social media platforms. As you know, we are highly shadow banned with stuff like this. And lastly, if you can afford it, you can see whether it's, buy me a coffee or whether it's Patreon or things of that nature. PayPal, if you can afford to support this channel, I certainly appreciate it. If you can't, save your money for your family and share this on all your social media platforms. Thanks a lot. We're out.